They laughed when I handed them the $28,500 repair invoice. One of them actually slid it back across the table and said, "That's not the HOA's problem." Less than 24 hours later, 6 luxury lake houses were locked, furious owners were calling nonstop, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk. I've worked property maintenance for almost 11 years, and in that time, I've dealt with every kind of entitled homeowner you can imagine. But nobody, and I mean nobody, was worse than the HOA board at Willow Creek Lake Estates. On paper, it looked like a dream community: private docks, luxury cabins, golf carts, lake views, and a polished little brochure that made it seem like everyone there lived in some kind of peaceful retirement paradise. In reality, it was 6 wealthy board members making decisions for 200 residents like they owned the entire shoreline. I wasn't a resident there. I was the contractor they depended on. My company handled gate systems, marina access, emergency maintenance, dock power, and most of the lock and security infrastructure around the lake houses. Basically, if something electronic stopped working on that property, they called me. And for years, I kept that place running. Not because they were easy to work with, they weren't, but because I knew the systems better than anyone else. About 3 months before everything exploded, the HOA decided to save money by rejecting my recommendation to replace the aging electrical control panel that powered the East Dock Zone and several utility lock systems near the lake houses. I warned them in writing that the panel was unstable, outdated, and vulnerable to water intrusion. It wasn't a maybe. It was a when. I told them directly, if this thing fails during a storm, it won't just knock out dock lights. It could cascade into the access systems and damage equipment across multiple lakefront properties. They said my estimate was inflated. They said I was fear-selling. One board member, a guy named Randall, who wore loafers without socks and acted like every sentence out of his mouth should be framed, actually told me, "You contractors always think worst case because it helps your invoices." So they voted against the preventative replacement. Fine. I documented everything, sent the email, archived the quote, and moved on. Then came the storm. It hit late on a Thursday night, one of those ugly spring systems with sideways rain, lightning over the lake, and enough wind to knock branches into power lines. I was already home when my emergency line started blowing up around 1:17 a.m. East Dock access was down. 2 boathouse locks were dead. Utility control at the lake houses was glitching. Then came the call I had been expecting for months. "We've got multiple failures across the lakefront cluster," the night security guy said, "and people are panicking." I drove out there in the rain, and the second I opened the East utility housing, I knew exactly what happened. Water had gotten into the old panel, shorted half the relay bank, and sent enough corrupted current through the system to fry multiple connected lock controllers and access modules. It was bad. Not just a blown fuse, bad. Full system contamination, bad. I spent the next 14 hours on site, soaked, sleep-deprived, and trying to stop the damage from spreading. By the end of that first day, I'd stabilized the main line, isolated the compromised circuits, and identified the full repair scope. The total damage? $28,000 to $500. That included emergency labor, controller replacement, lock module rebuilds, dock access restoration, and a full electrical cleanup of the East cluster. It should have been a straightforward claim. This wasn't random damage. This happened because they knowingly ignored a documented warning and refused a preventative repair. I compiled the invoice, attached my prior recommendation, included the warning email, and walked into the Monday HOA board meeting with everything printed and tabbed. I thought maybe, just maybe, once they saw the paper trail, they'd own it. That was my mistake. The room was exactly what you'd expect. 6 board members sitting around a polished wood table, all pretending this was a serious governance body instead of a country club with voting rights. Randall was there, of course, leaning back like he was about to reject a wine list. I handed out the invoices and started explaining the chain of failure. I was calm, professional, and very specific. I pointed to the original estimate. I pointed to the warning email. I explained how the storm exposed a vulnerability they'd already been told to address. I even made it simple. This bill exists because the board voted against a repair that would have prevented it. Silence. Then Randall slid the invoice back across the table and said, "That's not the HOA's problem." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Another board member, Cynthia, chimed in and said, "Weather events are acts of God. We're not paying because nature happened." I looked at her and said, "Nature didn't ignore my warning email. You did." That's when things got ugly. Randall started implying I was trying to extort the association. Someone else suggested I should eat some of the cost if I wanted to preserve the business relationship. Then the HOA attorney, who had probably been fed half the story, said they saw no clear liability. No clear liability? They had literally voted no on the exact repair that would have prevented this. I stood there for about 5 more minutes, listening to people who couldn't reset a breaker explain infrastructure responsibility to me. Then I gathered my papers, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "Understood," and I left. They thought they'd won. What they forgot was this. My company didn't just repair their systems. Under the service agreement they loved ignoring, we also administered emergency credentialing, temporary access authorizations, and lock code renewals for all lakefront properties under the HOA's Managed Rental and Guest Use Program. In simpler terms, if a lake house changed hands for the weekend, if a board member wanted guest access, if someone needed dockside smart lock support, that workflow came through my system. And after a major electrical event, every affected property was required by policy to receive a post-incident access security reset before being reauthorized. That wasn't my personal rule. That was their own risk management clause. The same clause they made me enforce for years. So the next morning, I did exactly what the contract required. I flagged all 6 board-owned lake houses in the affected cluster as pending safety recertification and suspended digital re-entry authorization until the damaged lock ecosystems were formally approved and paid through the emergency repair channel. In plain English, I locked them out. Not illegally, not emotionally, contractually, perfectly, beautifully. I made sure residents still had emergency exit functionality, because I'm not reckless. But the remote unlocks, guest codes, dockside side gate credentials, and vacation re-entry permissions, disabled until compliance. Then I sat back and waited. It took 47 minutes. The first call came from Cynthia. "My daughter can't get into Lake House 3, I said. "That unit is pending post-incident recertification." She snapped, "Fix it," I said. "The repair event remains unresolved." She hung up on me. Then Randall called, furious. "Why is my property inaccessible?" I told him exactly why. Per HOA Policy Section 8.4, access systems in a contaminated event zone cannot be reauthorized until post-damage remediation is approved and closed. Silence. Then, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm reading your own policy?" He lost his mind. By noon, all 6 board members were in chaos. One had weekend guests arriving from out of town. Another had a catering delivery stuck at the gate. One guy apparently had wine club shipments sitting in the sun because his service entrance credentials had expired overnight. And the best part? None of them could accuse me of doing anything improper because I had followed every documented process exactly as written. They had built the machine. I had just pressed the button. Around 2:15 p.m., I got the email I'd been waiting for. The board would like to reopen discussion regarding the emergency repair invoice. Reopen discussion. Amazing what happens when consequences become inconvenient. I showed up to that second meeting with the same binder, same invoice, same calm tone, completely different room. Nobody leaned back this time. Nobody smirked. Randall looked like he hadn't slept. Cynthia wouldn't even make eye contact. Their attorney suddenly had a much more flexible interpretation of liability. I let them talk first. They tried to frame it like they were working toward resolution. I didn't let them spin it. I put the original estimate in the middle of the table and said, You were warned. You voted no. The system failed exactly how I said it would. I repaired it under emergency conditions to protect your property and your residents. This invoice is not negotiable. Then I added one more thing. And until it's paid, I will continue following every access compliance policy this board has ever asked me to enforce. That landed. Hard. They asked for 10 minutes in private. I waited outside by the lake, watching 2 ducks fight over a bread crust while 6 rich people argued over the bill they should have paid 3 months earlier. 23 minutes later, they called me back in. Full payment approved. Emergency surcharge included. Wire transfer by end of business. I asked for one more condition, a signed acknowledgement that my original preventative recommendation had been rejected by board vote, and that future infrastructure warnings would be entered into the official maintenance record without alteration. They didn't like that part. I didn't care. They signed it. The money hit my account at 4:42 p.m. I verified the transfer, reopened the access queue, reissued the digital credentials, and by sunset their precious lake houses were functioning again. But the story didn't end there. Because word got out. HOA communities run on gossip the way boats run on fuel, and within a week, half the neighborhood knew the board had refused a repair bill after ignoring a written warning, and then got locked out of their own lake houses by the very contractor they tried to stiff. Residents started asking questions. A couple of them requested maintenance records. One homeowner emailed me privately and said, "Thank you for finally standing up to them." Another told me Randall had spent 2 years treating every vendor like disposable labor. Suddenly, the board didn't look powerful anymore. They looked careless, embarrassed, exposed. And that's the part they hated most. Not the invoice, not the lockout. The fact that for once they couldn't hide behind rules they only enforced on other people. A month later, Willow Creek quietly renewed my service contract at my updated rate. No negotiation, no attitude. Just a short email that said, "Please send over your 12-month proposal." I did. It was 18% higher. They signed it in 2 days. Since then, I've kept things professional. I do the work, I document everything, and I never assume common sense will win over ego. Because if there's one thing that HOA board members like that always forget, it's this. Power only works when everyone around you is willing to pretend you deserve it. The second someone stops playing along, the whole performance falls apart. And in their case, it fell apart the moment they decided my $28,500 invoice wasn't their problem. So tell me honestly, if an HOA refused to pay after ignoring your warning, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have taken them to court instead? Drop your opinion in the comments and subscribe for more HOA revenge and entitled neighbor stories.